Hi, welcome. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of MercyOne Cancer Center and founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to the Cancer Education Series. It is supported in part by a grant from the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And welcome our guest, Sonya Mack. And Sonya is a PA, a physician's assistant. So I can't resist asking her about how do you become a physician's assistant? And we actually are colleagues. Sonya is a physician's assistant for our plastic surgeon at Mercy, and she is involved in the care of many, many cancer patients. But we're not actually going to talk about being a physician assistant or being involved in plastic surgery and reconstruction of breast cancer. We're going to talk about finding joy. So Sonya, why are we going to talk about finding joy?
Well, I think first of all, it's a really important topic for anybody, but especially for cancer patients or cancer survivors, because I think sometimes when we get a new cancer diagnosis, it can be really overwhelming. And sometimes when you have that incredible overwhelm, being able to think ahead to a time where there might be or there will be joy again, is an important thing to remember. And so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of how we might get there from something that seems very painful or overwhelming to something that eventually we can look back on and think actually about living joy.
I so agree with you. I do believe that it is part of being a human being to figure out what brings joy into your life and to figure out what you can do to help bring joy into other people's life. And I can tell you at least 6 times today in meeting with patients, I said, so tell me, what's brought you the most joy since you and I last visited?
Right.
So I'm glad we're gonna spend an hour talking about finding joy.
Yeah.
Was there something in your life that led you to this sort of epiphany that, I need to focus on how to bring joy in my life?
Yes, there was. So in 2005, actually, my mom was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. For people who don't know, Lou Gehrig's disease eventually over time kind of degenerates a person's muscles. So it takes away their ability to walk or talk or eat. And eventually it's pretty much fatal for everyone. And so and at the time that she passed, which was 10 years ago, I was only 29. So, not as young as some people who lose their mom, but still a very formidable time in my life. And so that was also a very painful time in my life. And my mom had always told me that she named me Sonya Joy Mack because I was meant to spread joy to the world. But here's this person who told me that, number one. And number two, how do I find joy in such a painful part or period of my life? And so during that extremely painful time, I just kept feeling this gut feeling. For me, Holy Spirit, universe, there's all kinds of words people can use for it. But I kept feeling this feeling like this painful process in my life was meant for something bigger or something different. And I wouldn't come to fully know that for probably almost 10 years, which is not the case for everyone, but I think it just is a process that we sometimes, and that I needed to go through in order to get there. But yeah, so it was definitely one very specific event in my life that created this.
Yeah, and you're understanding that the world and the universe is bigger than that event, and that you're part of something bigger. There's something, and you're right. Different people call it different things.
Yep.
So I know that you have a bit of a presentation. So why don't we start with that? We'll delve into that. And so we're going to bring up the slide. You and I are going to become smaller on the screen.
Okay.
And I may interrupt you from time to time so we can have a conversation. But your first slide is up, which is nice. I wish I had a middle name like Joy.
Yes, it's funny though how I used to actually really not like that middle name because it was so different than everyone else's. But over time you realize that there's a reason for a lot of this, and it's a reason bigger than we are, than you are. So kind of how I explained that first slide is just something bigger, something different, and that that was just a feeling, an internal feeling I just kept getting, and just eventually learned to realize that it was bringing purpose and joy to this gray area of pain, grief, loss for me. And not only that, but there's something, and you mentioned it earlier when you said helping others, there's something about getting to a place where you can take something that you've learned and kind of reach your hand out behind you and help someone who's coming along in that place. And that's kind of where I've gotten to in this point of my life, and something that I'm excited about. So
yeah, maybe how would you define joy? So what is joy, and maybe what is not joy? Because I
sure.
think same with the word happiness, but I really love the word joy. So what are components of joy as opposed to pleasure?
Sure. So a lot of words like happiness, pleasure, those kinds of words to me, and I think to a lot of people and in a lot of books that I've read, they're more fleeting. They're more fleeting emotions.
And superficial.
And superficial. Yep. Where joy is something that usually kind of is like a plant that takes root. You know, it really digs down in. It's rooted more firmly. And a lot of that comes because it takes more time to develop. You know, being able to, again, go from something painful to joy is not something that happens quickly. It's a continuum. It's a process. And so there again, I think joy is something that we learn and we can practice more so than just those other superficial emotions.
I would agree. Deep-seated. It's a flourishing. You know, Aristotle uses the word eudaimonia, which is really the flourishing of life, and that type of joy, the path to that type of joy includes suffering.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas sort of the superficial happiness, pleasure is like, let's go around the suffering and just delve into sitting on the beach for a while. Whereas the type of joy you're talking about is this deep-seated flourishing of life.
Yes. One of the quotes I read in a book that I use the most in my own life to remind myself that is, the struggle is intentional. So the struggle is not necessarily that, but like you said, suffering too. There's something to be learned there. It's not always fun when we're going through it. In fact, it's almost never fun when we're going through it, but there is this place when we can come out on the other side and look back in hindsight and recognize what we went through, what we accomplished through it.
Yeah. And on a sort of just a trivial example, I take people climbing a mountain. We promise suffering. You do not get from sea level to 10,000 feet without there being some suffering along the way. But the joy that comes out of understanding what you've accomplished. Something is too easy, the joy is just this fleeting pleasure.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. I love that too, to think of it as an accomplishment too. I think the feeling of joy, very much so, from what you've gone through, can be considered an accomplishment. Yeah. But that's not to go back to my slides, but I found this quote that I really love, because to me, what I've found a lot of is oftentimes kind of the pathway from pain to joy, it involves some kind of hope. And so this quote is one that I keep up, and it reminds me, and hope begins in the dark, the stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. And again, that's kind of what you have said. You'll go through this suffering, but if you just show up every day and do your part, the dawn will eventually come. The joy will eventually come.
Yeah, and it also that quote speaks to that you have a responsibility. You have agency. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. You're showing up, and you are contributing to what will become joy.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Sorry, switch. But yes, so where I so over the years, and that's where I explained that this this pathway of mine, what I call the live joy life. So that really came over the last 10 years of 15 really, since my mom was sick, of just I'm a creative. Sometimes I joke that maybe medicine was the wrong field for me. It's not. I love it, but I'm a writer. I draw, I doodle, I sing. Like that's how I think everybody has their way of dealing with pain or frustration, or and so I'm a creative, and all through that whole process of those very painful issues that I've had is through writing. And over time, through this journaling and writing, is how I've kind of noticed these repetitive habits that were very helpful to me in getting through some of the most painful periods of my life. So that's where I came up with what I call the ACE method. It just kind of works for me to explain it that way, because it makes it a little more systematic for people. And ACE stands for assess, contemplate, and execute. And really, it's just taking this, because when we have a painful or a suffering experience, it can be very overwhelming, and it can be more than just one thing going on. A lot of people that are dealing with grief or loss or a new diagnosis are also dealing with 5 or 6 other things that they have going on in their life at the same time. And so I've used this ACE method in my life many times. And in fact, I just did it a couple days ago, not even really thinking about the fact that we had this talk today. But just, it kind of takes a situation that seems very overwhelming and kind of gives you back a little bit of control. Because sometimes I think when we have too many things going on that feel outside of our control, it's that loss of control that gives us that feeling of fear and grief and so many other feelings like that. So it's kind of, in my opinion, that the overwhelm and the painful feeling that we can get from whatever's going on in our life a lot of times comes from this loss of an expectation. So if you think about there's many things. So if you think about, for me, when my mom died, I had this expectation that my mom would live well past 60, right? And we would go on these trips together, and she would be there when my children were born. And kind of another personal example would be, both of my children were born and had to go to the NICU, and one almost died. And, that was a loss of an expectation for a normal newborn period. What we see, you see, and what we see in plastic surgery when we see so many breast cancer survivors and patients is this, they had an expectation for what the future was going to look like, and cancer wasn't part of that, And so when you are confronted with this change in what you expected your future to look like, that can be a very painful experience. I'm sure that you've seen that in your own world.
And some of them, there's wisdom gained in years, and you don't have to get to be very old to realize there are going to be bumps in your road.
Yes.
And that this idea that a perfect life would be just this really flat, everything is fine. Well, everything's never going to be fine forever.
Right.
And in reality, it's learning how to deal with those bumps. And the more we deal with the bumps, the better we are at dealing with the bumps. And sometimes we even intentionally put a bump in our road. We go to PA school, we go to medical school, we intentionally climb a mountain knowing there's going to be suffering along the way.
Right.
Because we've learned that we can deal with bumps.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I think this ACE method that I've used, this is actually something that I feel has helped a lot of people in my life. And just so friends of mine, or also people in the community that I've helped with this, but it just gives you a systematic way to help go through that bump.
So talk more about assessment.
Yeah. Yep.
So what do you mean? What's involved with assessing?
Sure. there's a slide, sorry, just in case people wanted to look at it. But so assessing is honoring the why of how you're feeling. So when you get, say it's a cancer diagnosis, or you have, a baby that's born with concerns, or are grieving the loss of a loved one, examples we've all used, there's a lot of feelings associated with that. And assess is really just giving some words and some feelings to maybe why you're feeling that way. So I call it like the who, what, when, where, why of how I'm feeling. It can be something you just do with yourself. It can be something you do with a friend or a family member, and it can even be something you do with a therapist. I know a lot of I personally do it a lot with I have a spiritual director that I use, that I see once a month. But I think any of those avenues, and like I said, even yourself, sometimes it's good to just sit down with yourself. But so assessing kind of so it's as simple as taking a piece of paper and just writing down what's all bothering me, what's making me feel overwhelmed, what's taking my mind away from the things that I want it to be used for, like spending time with my family, or being able to focus on things. Yesterday when I sat down with mine, it was things like kids, work, because we are very busy at work right now, family, and then I actually wrote a book and it's supposed to be published this year, and so I'm learning how to market a book. Something I've never. So I just listed all those 4 things, and then I went through each of them and I assessed, how am I feeling about this? Why do I feel this way? What's causing me to feel this way? Is there something specific I can do? And then I just kind of yesterday talked to my husband about some of them, but a lot of times I would talk to my spiritual director or a friend about them too. And it's never to trivialize what you're going through. It's not to say that what you're going through can just simply be explained in a few words or symptoms, or it's nothing like that, because it's more about a way of allowing yourself to feel those feelings and know that they're normal and know that it's okay. But it's taking what's swirling around in your brain and putting it in a place that seems more.
It makes it concrete too, because you can spend hours just going through loops of things that are just don't even really make sense. So writing it down really makes you really define what you're thinking.
Yes. And it also kind of can not diminish or eliminate your fears, but it can make them seem a little less, it can bring them down to size a little bit. Sometimes when you take something and you can put it on paper, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's not as big as I put it up here in my head, which is a game that we all play in our own heads when we get a little overwhelmed and everything sometimes. So really that's the first step, is just and that will look differently for everyone, depending on what they're going through at this particular time in their life, and how they're feeling about it. And it can change. Sometimes I do this once a week, sometimes I do it once a month. It really just depends on when there seems to be so many things that I just need a minute to write it all down.
So assessment, first step.
Yep, assess is the first step.
And next we're going to
contemplate. Yep. So this is really where when I kind of explain that I've been a writer or journaler my whole life, this is like a 10-year process for me. It was finding this place where I was like, okay, I'm supposed to find joy somewhere in this pain. How in the world am I going to do that? And it was over and over again, just through years of writing and reading books and talking to people, and for me, prayer. But everybody's got their way that they like to get through stuff. There were these 12 what I call principles, that they're positive principles. They're things that bring joy to most people, and they are just these, like I said, 12 principles that just kept coming up over and over again throughout this 10-year process. And when I would read back through, I would read things about laughter, or, and how powerful laughter can be. Or I would read about someone who had an inspired thought to write a book, which is what happened with me, but it's, so when I say contemplate, I'm talking about taking each of those areas of your life that you wrote down that seemed overwhelming. And then for me, the next slide has the principles. Thank you so much. It's really sitting down with, for me, these 12 principles that are very positive. Some people would call them spiritual principles, but for me, they're just really positive life actions. So faith it can be faith in a higher power. It can also just be faith in yourself, believing in yourself to be able to move past this, and the strength that you have internally. Things like hope, which we already talked about. Love is pretty self-explanatory, loving yourself and loving others. Laughter, there's lots of books written about the power of laughter to improve your mood. There's lots of medical studies that you've probably read some about laughter and just the power of that before.
Humor.
Laughter,
yes.
Yep. And I don't know about you, but I know over the 10 years that I've been in plastic surgery, there's a few women specifically that come to mind that just the power of laughter to help them get through what they were getting through, and they would even say, well, if you can't laugh about it, and that's not everyone's personality, but it definitely, those people leave a mark in your mind.
Yeah. I think, philosophically, but then also physiologically.
Yes.
Some of the most joyful time, you get into some silly laughter with a conversation with friends where you just can hardly catch your breath and you're nearly quiet. Well, the physiology that's happening in your body, and the endorphins that are released, and everything has this flood of good feeling that lasts for hours after a deep-seated good belly laugh.
Right, exactly. I know myself sometimes when I kind of get into a mood or a situation, I'll just go watch on YouTube. I'll watch the America's Funniest Home Videos. Do you remember the old show? I don't even think they make those anymore. But we used to watch that all the time as a kid, and that's what we as a family sometimes will do. I'll even do that with my young kids because, my oldest has ADHD and my youngest has a sensory disorder, and it's hard for them to get through school all day because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of things they have to hold together. And so sometimes when we get home, we just watch funny videos because everybody needs to laugh, or we have tickle parties, or we have dance parties, which is literally we just turn music on in our house and we dance and be silly and crazy because that's the power of laughter, to be able to bring joy, and then just to run, not to, hit on a couple more. Choice, that one's a little tricky sometimes. I don't want to insinuate that we always have a choice. So we always have a choice. It's not necessarily the choice we want to make. But just to know that whenever you're faced with something, there's a choice. And so again, it's not to say that, I usually use the example, I didn't choose for my mom to have ALS, right? But I also, in the time that she was living with ALS, she and I chose to do a lot of things that knock a lot of things off her bucket list,
and you can choose the perspective you have on this.
Right.
You can't change the event that just happened, but you can choose what you're going to do about it,
right?
How it's going to affect you. It's again that thing of agency. I have a part to play here. The way I respond to this can influence how it affects me.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I do tell some of our, some of our breast cancer women will come in and you walk in and you ask them, how are you doing today? And sometimes the answer is, today's not a good day. And that's okay too, I think. And I tell them that too. It's okay to have days where you're like, today's not a good day, but tomorrow's going to be better. Today is my day to just be frustrated and be a little bit angry about what's going on, but tomorrow will be a better day. So I think that's okay too. Generosity, obviously, that's not just giving of your, I always usually say time, talent, and treasure. So giving of yourself or your gifts to other people. Gratitude is just such a powerful emotion, isn't it?
And those two are sort of the flip
Mhm.
side of the coin. I mean, being generous, but then also being grateful for generosity that others have given you.
Right. And oftentimes I'll find when, if money trouble happens to be something that someone is going through, in talking to them about the situation, a lot of times we'll find that gratitude and generosity are actually very closely tied to it. And so it's just something, it's always just fun to see people's minds kind of open up a little bit when we talk about this, because it's not always something we think about. You know, especially if we're having concerns about money, the last thing we think about is, not everyone, but oftentimes it's hard to think about being generous when you don't have enough. But there's kind of an ebb and flow of that positivity that comes, you know, we're all filled with an energy. The earth is filled with, everybody's filled with energy. And there's an ebb and flow that comes back and forth.
Yeah, we can't, the same person can't be the one always being generous and always being the giver. That the natural order of things is there needs to be giving and receiving.
Yes.
And give with generosity, but receive with gratitude.
Yes.
Both of those work. It's kind of like a hug. Doesn't matter who initiated it. It works in both directions.
Yeah. And I think you'll often find that those who are generous often have a hard time being receivers, and those who are really well, you know, and so it's good to work on both sides of the coin. Yep. Fortitude is one of my favorites. It's actually courage in the face of adversity. So it's not just courage, but it's courage when you have something very scary or that's causing you a lot of, you know, that you want to be fearful, but it's having courage in the face of that. So that's a big word for me. I use fortitude a lot because I think there's something about just believing in yourself enough to find that courage to move forward. And I think that's huge with cancer survivors too. If we can remind them how much power there is inside of them, really, to be able, and how incredible they are. I mean, they go through so much. The women, it's mostly women that we deal with just with breast cancer, but the women that we spend time with, just to see the fortitude that they have.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And courage is not the absence of fear.
Right.
So it's not fearlessness. Courage is understanding the fear and still moving forward.
Yeah, doing it
and allowing fear to be a source of creativity and ingenuity. And the courage is processing it, taking the next step, knowing that there is danger there, but that you're still making the step.
Yeah, exactly. And then forgiveness, fairly self-explanatory, though often hard. Inspiration to me is kind of goes along with the one at the bottom there, that's stillness. So stillness comes when we live busy lives. Most people do. They're working a lot. We were just talking about 13-hour days or 10-hour days or 12-hour days that we have, but it's so important. When I think the busier you are, the more important it is to sometimes find that stillness, to be able to just again assess, and then I'll explain a little more about the contemplate. But when you're in that stillness is when you can achieve the inspiration, which is where that gut feeling came from. Being able to really look through and assess what you're feeling, and then also sit with those feelings and say, okay, which of these principles, which of these words are really sticking out to me and are the ones that I really feel like I should investigate more into. And then care of self kind of goes along with that. But taking care of yourself is emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Just taking care of all of the parts of us. So when I talk about contemplate, I really sit with these words. And sometimes this is minutes, sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's days, could be longer, before one or two of these words really kind of nudge me in such a way that I think, okay, yes, these are the ones that I need to work on in this particular situation. These are the things that for me to do right now. I wrote down a couple examples. I don't have to go through all of them, but for instance, someone who maybe just had a brand new cancer diagnosis, stillness might be something that's very important for them, because often they're going to multiple appointments and they're just getting this overload and abundance of information from doctors. A breast cancer patient's seeing 4 or 5 doctors
and
within a few days.
And they're still trying to get their kids to school and
yes,
put dinner on the table.
Exactly. And so just, allowing themselves to say, it's okay if I take 10 or 15 minutes by myself to just sit and, sit with myself and think about my feelings and think about how I'm feeling and look at, whatever it is, if they want to read a book or if they want to, because you can get inspiration from anywhere for next steps, books, people, a show. But I can't tell you how many times in my life, and I'm sure you can attest to this, if you've had like a thought as you pass maybe a magazine or a book in the store and you think, I should read that. And then you read it and there's something in there that clicks. You're like, oh, I was supposed to read that. Like that was meant for me. I needed to hear that,
Yeah, serendipity, which is people say God wink.
Yes.
There was something there. And if we don't take time to reflect on those values, those issues, everything just kind of goes by in a whirl.
Right.
So for me, being in nature is a good time for me to reflect, be silent, contemplate, whether it's walking through the woods, where you're appreciating the beauty and the stillness, but it puts me in a reflective mood.
Yes, exactly. Very much
and
so.
Sometimes solutions to problems just kind of come when you allow the time for that to generate.
Yes. Often in stillness, I think you find inspiration or for what your next step is, or what the answer to the question that you're looking for a lot of times, I think. And a couple other examples I wrote down that for me personally, once when I was having a troubled time with someone that I worked closely with, it was easier for me after I worked through it to remember love, right? Not physical, not emotion or romantic love, obviously, but love in like a respect for another human being kind of love. And then forgiveness, which helps you remember that that person is human as well, and then just hope, knowing that there's hope for the future. So again, it's really the contemplate part is really just sitting down with those feelings, those maybe 1 or 2 or 3 things that are really going on in your life, and then looking at it in such a way of, okay, what am I missing most right now, or what am I letting what can I do that will allow this overwhelming feeling to kind of become more concrete, like we talked about. And then the last part of the ACE method is this execute. What is mine to do? Yep. So what is mine to do? Yep.
You have assessed, you've contemplated, and now it's time to
put it in action. Yep. So it's a time for you to really implement and execute those. So let's say that you thought stillness was one of your ways that you would be helped by your situation. Again, allowing and giving yourself time for that stillness. say love was one of your principles or situations, how can I put love into action with this person that I'm frustrated with? For me, personally, so when my mom passed away, and then I had this pain, and I was looking for how do I get this joy back. Hope was one of the principles that I implemented, but another was inspiration. So I had an inspired thought, I should write a book. I should write a book that reminds people that even though our loved ones are gone, we never have to live them without them, because the powers of our memories of them are so strong, we can literally write them back into our story. And so I used hope and inspiration, and I took inspired action to write this book, even though it was scary.
Yeah.
So again, it's just giving you permission to take what you've realized you can use in your life, and just giving yourself permission to take that next step. So that's the execute.
And again, I've used this word before, but it's giving agency to
Yes.
you. Are a human being that has the power to do something.
Yes.
And what you choose to do affects your life.
Right. Exactly. Yep. And so yeah, it's really, I think the maybe the biggest takeaway is it's not we don't have to. I should say, I'm not here to advocate that you have to live joy all the time. Because like you said, you're going to have bumps in the road. Sometimes it's like in Mexico, I've been down there before, and on the way to the resort, you hit the topes, I think they're called, and it's like bump, 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 bump. And that's what life feels like sometimes. It's like one bump right after the other. But when life gets a little overwhelming like that, sometimes I think if we can take that overwhelming feeling and put it down concretely and work through it in a way that makes us feel like we have a little bit more to say about it.
And not to diminish the suffering that really truly exists,
right.
but understanding that, believe it or not, and with experience you believe it, this is the path to joy.
Yeah.
I'm not on some detour that's going into forever misery. The path to deep-seated joy includes this.
Right.
There's another thing that comes to mind. It's a phrase from a poem, and I love it because no matter, things just seem like totally out of control, and then you burn the food as well, and it's just like, oh my gosh. But it's whether you know it or not, the universe will unfold exactly as it should. And that most things, and really, at some point in time, we have to accept our own death as part of the universe. That whether you know it or not, everything will be all right.
Right.
Keep your head about you and look for the opportunities to find the joy and spread the joy.
Right. Exactly. And then once you've gotten to that point where you've felt like you're in a better place, and I love the part that you just said, spread the joy. And I think, and I kind of mentioned that earlier, take the hand of somebody who's behind you, who's going through the toughest times. And there's something, I have every other week I write emails to an email list that are part of this Live Joy Life. And I always sign them in this together, because I feel like there's something about community and knowing that we're all going through things, and there's just something about community and knowing that there's other people there to support you and walk through it with you, that just, it gives you hope in this time. So
and there is social science that does prove that gratitude journals, and helping somebody else really is the shortest path to bringing joy into your life.
Right.
So you might know this quote. This is one of my favorites. It's from the Dalai Lama. If you want others to be happy, spread joy. If you want to be happy, spread spread joy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's helping other people that is probably the fastest path
Right.
to happiness.
Exactly. Yep. That's absolutely true, I think. And probably one of the reasons I went into medicine, I think. Not that you can't serve and help other people in so many other ways, because you can, but there's just something about meeting someone at that place that I've just always felt very drawn to.
So your mom has been gone for how long now?
Yes, 11 years.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
To help with grief counseling.
Oh, sure.
Because one of the joys of being a cancer doctor is being involved with families in very intense times, and the relationships provide great sustenance, but there also comes with the love of those relationships, the loss that happens.
Mm-hmm.
The more that you deeply admire, respect, love someone, the more you're going to feel the loss.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you say your principles have applied to allowing you to continue to think of your mom with joy?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the first day it happens, there's a whole lot more bitter than sweet.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, that loss, which is always bittersweet, you remember the sweetness more than the bitter. How would you say you've incorporated your principles of finding joy into, when I mention your mom right now, of thinking of pleasant things rather than painful things?
Sure. And I think a lot of that comes on a continuum, kind of like you mentioned. In the beginning, very, very bitter time, right? And that time frame can go on for quite a while sometimes. But ultimately, when I think about that question and I think about my mom, what comes back to me, again, it's, and this is always my, I'm deeply connected to this, so I use this all the time, but love, number one, right? So this love that I had for her is what keeps me wanting to keep her story alive.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe another way of saying that,
yeah.
instead of saying the love you had for her, the love you
I
have for her.
Absolutely.
That endures.
Right. It 100% does. In fact, in my house, my children have never met my mom, but they know her. You know what I mean by that? They're 8 and 5, and they will say, I miss Grandma Vicky, like they've met her, even though they haven't. But that just speaks to how much I work to keep her memory alive, because she had so much love for us that, this is my way of honoring her, is to keep her memory alive. And so, yeah, I mean, we talk about they'll ask questions about Grandma Vicky. And it's funny when my dad lives in New Mexico now, but when he'll come home, they'll look at him and go, did you know Grandma Vicky? Because they didn't know them together. But just that love that you have for the person that you've lost, and how you truly can keep them a part of your life.
That can endure.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, in the book When Breath Becomes Air, there's the epilogue, which is written by Lucy, Paul's wife, who survives his death. And when she comes to realization, she thought that love died with it, that she finds great sustenance in knowing that the love endures, and that it doesn't just go away.
Right.
And that you can find sustenance that can help with grief in finding that.
Right. Yeah. And, you really can use that love and those memories that you have of the person that you've lost to just like the whole book I wrote, a lot of it is about that. My mom and I were supposed to go on all these trips, but you have these just such vivid memories. Like you know what they would have said in such and such situation. Or my mom always had this, I used to joke, she used to have this like naive nature. She just always thought the best of everyone, but sometimes got her in trouble, in places where she didn't know where she was, or that kind of stuff. And so, but I think that's really what I wanted to get across when I wrote that book, was just, to find someone who's in that grief situation and let them know, it really does hurt right now. It really does. And sometimes when you're in that part of the hurt, it's hard to get, it's hard to feel like you're going to get past that. But like they say, time heals all wounds, and it really does.
It's a good time to do some assessments and contemplation and some execution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell you what, we've got a live studio audience. We also have people that are watching us live stream. So why don't we open it up for some questions, or just sharing of reactions to Sonya's concept of finding joy, to live the joy life.
I love the way you put everything together.
Sure. The name of my book, so it's right now, it's entitled This Changes Everything, because the idea of this being the fact that you can take, that the person you've lost can still live in your future. That can change everything for a person who's grieving. The reason I say that's what it's entitled right now is I actually have a welcome or a marketing call with my publisher in a couple weeks, and there's a chance that they could suggest a different title. But yes, for right now, that's what it's called, is This Changes Everything. So, and I think it's also personal in that, my mother passing, that changed everything for me in so many ways. Just what I've gone through and developing the Live Joy Life and living out her memory and her story, all of that has changed everything for me. And what I do going forward, I feel like, is try to provide, information or help or love and support to people who are suffering, so that it might also change everything for them, in that sort of way. So yes, currently that's what the name of my book is. But I should know more in a couple weeks.
Other questions or reflections?
After looking at your 10 principles up here, I thought, well, maybe I should start doing that, because there's some stresses and strains that happens in your life and things like that. And this is a nice, gentle reminder that there's something to look at. Yeah. And is the 10 principles also in your book as well?
So they are not in this book. I'm writing another one. But I also have a day job and 2 small kids and a husband. So it takes a little longer sometimes to get to that, but that is going to be the majority of probably.
And there are 12 principles.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, you're right.
It's totally okay.
At first, when you said that, I thought, oh, are these going to be like the 12 steps? But ironically, and not to, but you've done some reading, so a great title, but you can't use it because it's already taken, is one of my favorite books is called The Book of Joy.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And they have 8 pillars of joy. Yeah. So there's a lot of similarity. Yes. But I just a question I would have for you is, do you schedule time for contemplation? Because as busy as you have to be, does it just appear an opportunity for time, or do you do something with your schedule to schedule time for contemplation?
Yes. So the most important principle for me almost always in my life is stillness, because I am so busy. Not to diminish any of the other principles. Before I forget, the principles are on, I have a website, thelivejoylife.com, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew they were on there, and I forgot to tell you that. But stillness has always been the most important. And yes, I schedule stillness. So my husband is very supportive of everything. And even some days when, I've been in the OR for 10 or 11 or 12 hours and he's been watching the girls, and I come home and we basically put them to bed. That period of time from when they go to bed, so usually about 8:30 to about 9 or 9:30, that's like stillness time for Sonya. That's quiet, whatever that looks like for, stillness looks different for everyone. For me, that's usually a little bit of reading of whichever book I'm happen to be reading, which is usually some kind of nonfiction, but sometimes it's just a fiction book that I want something lighthearted, and a lot of writing because I'm a journaler, and so just quiet contemplation time almost every night. But yeah, I think we all lead such busy lives. We have to schedule that stuff, and just like you have to, if you're going to get activity or exercise, I hate the word exercise. I usually either call it like movement or physical activity, or because exercise just sounds. Yeah. It sounds, I don't know. It has such
adventure fitness.
That's even better. I like that one.
We just like to incorporate some adventure fitness into our life. But right, if you don't schedule it, if you don't grab it first thing,
Yeah, exactly.
That opportunity to grab it is gone.
But I think you'll find over time in your life, there are certain things that you need the most to function well off of. And once you can find that and schedule that into your life, it just makes things work so much smoother. But I do find that, if I do happen to like, oh, tonight I don't need to do it or whatever, and if I let it go too many nights, then all of a sudden things have spiraled.
Whether they're good or bad.
Yes.
What you do today, you're going to do tomorrow.
Yes. And then that's when I found myself sitting quietly the other day, writing down all of the things that were in my brain because it was too much. And then I forced myself into a contemplation phase because I needed to.
Most of us learn how to brush our teeth every day and stick with it for the rest of our lives.
Yes.
But we don't always stick with the exercise, the prayer, the stillness, like the making of your bed.
Right.
But we manage to remember to brush our teeth every day. So
yes.
That's a good thing.
I know. But yeah.
Well, Sonya, this has been great. Thank you for sharing with us your live joy life. And I really love the concepts, and thanks for sharing it.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining us. If you're watching this and you know someone that might enjoy this, this has been recorded, and this video podcast will be on the MercyOne Cancer Center website, and will also be on the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel, so you can watch it again. Thanks again for joining us, and please come again next week. Thanks.